Nearly 27 years after an 11-year-old boy was abducted at gunpoint while riding his bike home with friends in rural Minnesota, investigators finally got the answer that had eluded them since 1989. The man who confessed was not some stranger discovered by chance decades later. He was a suspect police had spoken to in the first months of the case. He had given samples. His tires had even been compared to tracks from the scene. But the case drifted. Theories changed. Suspicion moved to the wrong person, and the truth stayed buried in a field for almost 3 decades. Then preserved evidence from another boy's assault changed everything. Before we dive deep into this case, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories like this matter to you, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. To understand why this case shook not just one family, but an entire region, you have to go back to St. Joseph, Minnesota, on Sunday, October 22, 1989. Jacob Wetterling was 11 years old. He lived with his family in a quiet rural area outside town, a place where children still rode bikes after dark, and neighbors believed they knew each other. By every account, Jacob was a sweet, normal kid. He loved sports, especially football, and that Sunday had been an ordinary, happy day. He had spent time with his father, and nothing about the hours before nightfall suggested that his name would soon become known across the country. That evening, Jacob was home with his younger brother Trevor and his friend Aaron. Their parents had gone out for the night. At some point, the boys decided to bike to a nearby convenience store called Tom Thumb to rent a movie. It was not a long trip. They got permission, took a flashlight, and headed out. On the ride there, nothing unusual happened. They picked out a movie and started back home. But by the time they reached the long gravel driveway near the Wetterling property, it was dark, quiet, and isolated. Then a man stepped out and stopped them. He was dressed in black and wore a mask. He told the boys he had a gun. He ordered them to throw their bikes into the ditch and lie face down. At first, they may have thought it was some kind of prank, but that illusion ended fast. The man asked their ages one by one. Trevor said he was 10. Aaron said he was 11. Jacob said he was 11. The attacker then told Trevor to run into the woods and not look back. He gave Aaron the same order. If they looked back, he said, he would shoot. The boys ran. When they finally turned around, Jacob and the masked man were gone. It was around 9:20 p.m. That was the last time Jacob Wetterling was seen alive. Trevor and Aaron rushed back to the house, screaming that someone had taken Jacob. A neighbor called Jacob's parents and then 911. But one of the first painful facts in this case is that the initial response was not as clear or decisive as it needed to be. Officers questioned the boys, and early on there was doubt about whether an abduction had actually happened. According to later accounts, some investigators wondered if the boys were hiding an accident or if Jacob had run away. The search did not fully begin until roughly 10:45 p.m., about 90 minutes after the abduction. In a child abduction case, those first minutes matter more than almost anything. When the search finally expanded, it became massive. Firefighters, volunteers, law enforcement officers, helicopters, bloodhounds, and eventually thousands of community members joined in. Searchers found footprints and tire tracks near the abduction site. The town was small, but the investigation would become one of the biggest searches for a missing child in U.S. history. And still, nothing. No Jacob, no body, no clear suspect who could be charged, only a frightened community and a family thrown into an endless wait. Very early in the case, investigators did speak to a man named Danny Heinrich. He lived in Paynesville, about 30 miles away. In late 1989 and early 1990, agents interviewed him more than once. He denied involvement. He provided shoes and body hair samples. Investigators searched the home of his father, where he had been staying. Tire evidence from his car was described as consistent with, though not an exact match to, tire tracks from the scene. A shoe impression also corresponded in some respects to one of his shoes, but not strongly enough for a conclusive match. In other words, police were looking at him. But they did not have enough to charge him, and over time the case moved elsewhere. As the years passed, another name began to dominate the investigation. Dan Rassier, a neighbor whose property sat near the abduction site. Investigators eventually shifted to a theory that the abductor had approached on foot, not in a vehicle. That change was critical because it placed greater suspicion on someone local to the immediate area. By 2004, law enforcement had asked Rassier to admit involvement. In July 2010, investigators searched the Rassier farm, dug up portions of the property, and publicly labeled him a person of interest. Helicopters covered the search. His face became tied to the case in the public mind. But lab testing from that search produced no evidence connecting him to Jacob's disappearance. Years later, when the real killer confessed, the damage done to Rassier's life would be impossible to ignore. While that was happening, another case from 1989 was quietly waiting in the evidence room. On January 13, 1989, about 9 months before Jacob's abduction, a 12-year-old boy named Jared Shirel was abducted in nearby Cold Spring, Minnesota. A man in a car approached him, threatened him with a gun, forced him into the vehicle, sexually assaulted him, and later released him with a warning not to look back and not to tell anyone. The similarities between Jared's case and Jacob's were deeply unsettling. The age range, the use of a gun, the rural location, the control tactics, even the use of a police scanner, all suggested the same type of offender. At the time, Heinrich had also been scrutinized in Jared's case, but again nothing strong enough had been built. Then science finally caught up. In July 2015, investigators reported that the predominant male DNA profile found on Jared Shirel's sweatshirt matched DNA samples that had been taken from Danny Heinrich back in 1990. That was the breakthrough the case had needed for years. Suddenly, the suspect who had once been interviewed and released was back at the center of everything. On July 28, 2015, investigators searched Heinrich's home in Annandale, Minnesota. What they found did not just deepen suspicion, it exposed a much darker picture. Authorities seized child pornography, including 19 binders, along with other disturbing materials. Heinrich was charged federally on child pornography counts, and the pressure on him began to build. By this point, the Jacob Wetterling investigation had generated tens of thousands of leads over the years. The family had spent nearly 27 years living between hope and dread. One of the most heartbreaking details in the entire case is how Jacob's parents kept that hope alive. According to the source account, every year on Jacob's birthday, they lit a candle on a cupcake and left a light on for him, holding on to the possibility that somehow, one day, he might still come home. That is what unresolved child abduction cases do. They do not end. They suspend a family in place. In 2016, Heinrich agreed to a deal. In exchange for pleading guilty to federal child pornography charges and admitting what he had done, he would not be separately prosecuted for Jacob's murder. It was a deeply controversial decision. For many people, it felt impossible to accept. But for investigators and for the Wetterling family, the deal offered something the case had never been able to produce before: the truth, a confession, and the chance to bring Jacob home. When Heinrich finally confessed, the details were devastating. He admitted that on the night of October 22, 1989, he had been driving around St. Joseph and saw the three boys. He parked and waited for them to return. He approached them exactly as Trevor and Aaron had described. He forced them into the ditch, sent the two other boys running, handcuffed Jacob, and put him in his car. Then he drove away. At one point, according to the confession relayed in the source video, Jacob was crying and asking, "What did I do wrong?" That single line captures the entire horror of the case. An 11-year-old child, trying to understand why this was happening to him. In the final hours of his life, Heinrich said he drove Jacob to an area near Paynesville, sexually assaulted him, and then panicked after seeing a patrol car pass nearby. He ordered Jacob to turn around and tried to shoot him. The gun jammed the first time. Then he fired again and killed him. Later, Heinrich returned with equipment, buried the body, and eventually moved the remains to a cow pasture. On August 31, 2016, he led investigators to the burial site. According to the Department of Justice, Jacob's remains were recovered on September 2, nearly 27 years after he vanished. There is one final detail from the source account that makes this story even harder to process. Investigators reportedly brought a metal detector because Jacob had been wearing a red jacket with metal buttons. But at the burial site, a small piece of red fabric was already visible above the ground. For years, it had been there, unnoticed, while the truth lay just beneath it. In cases like this, time does not simply pass, it hardens. It settles over evidence, over memory, over mistakes, until only persistence and better science can break through it. On September 6, 2016, Heinrich pleaded guilty in federal court to child pornography charges and admitted that he had abducted, sexually assaulted, and murdered Jacob Wetterling, as well as abducted and sexually assaulted a 12-year-old boy in January 1989. The parties jointly recommended a 20-year federal prison sentence. It was not the ending people had imagined when they thought of justice for Jacob, but it was the ending that finally gave his family answers. Jacob was found, Jacob was named, and the man who took him was no longer a person of interest. He was a confessed killer. The Jacob Wetterling case leaves 3 practical lessons. The first is that preserved evidence matters more than anyone may realize at the time it is collected. The evidence tied to Jared Shirell's assault sat for years before DNA technology was able to turn it into the break that solved Jacob's case. If that evidence had been lost, degraded, or discarded, this story may never have reached a resolution. The second is that tunnel vision can destroy innocent lives even when investigators believe they are helping. Dan Rassier spent years under public suspicion, but the search of his property produced no evidence. In long unsolved cases, pressure can push investigators toward a theory they want to be true. That pressure has to be resisted, because once a case turns toward the wrong person, time is lost and real leads can be missed. The third is that some cases are not solved because someone suddenly gets lucky. They are solved because someone refuses to stop. This case lasted nearly 27 years. Investigators changed, strategies changed, technology changed, but the file stayed open, the family kept asking, and eventually the combination of persistence and science did what the early years could not. If this case moved you, let me know your thoughts below. And if you want more long-form cold case stories told in this style, don't forget to subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.